Hello and welcome back to part two of our Insurance Times expert view with RSA's Adele Sumner, who is head of counter fraud and financial crime. This time we'll be focusing in a bit more on the technology angle of fraud and how we can combat that as well. So welcome back, Adele. Thanks for speaking to us again. So I wanted to zero in on something we were talking about last time, which was the technologically enabled aspects of fraud, things like shallow and deep fakes that we spoke about previously. How can we, as a sector, use technology in the arms race against fraudsters to effectively counter it?
Yeah, so probably again in reflective mode, I've seen fraud technologies and so many of them over the years. Actually, the market for fraud technology is full of different solutions with different fraud types actually that they're targeting, be that documentation, be that voice, be that entity resolution, be that scoring, articulation models, is that a machine learning model, a predictive model, the market's actually awash with different solutions. So from a fraud strategy perspective, it's absolutely vital that you pick the right technology for the fraud risks you have in your business.
Right.
So key thing for me here at RSA is making sure that, again, back to the earlier points, we define what fraud risks we have, and then we look for what fraud technology we actually need to combat those threats. Now, that also means that you need some flexibility in there, because you've always got to be thinking about what's coming next. What other types of fraud have you got to defend against? And so that's always quite interesting from I suppose, a detection perspective.
So I think that's an excellent point about making sure that technology actually serves a specific use case within the business. And maybe you could explain that a bit further with reference to an example from RSA as well. I mean, how have you used the technology to solve a problem with the business?
Well, if you think about the way we interact business, that's the most important thing. If you interact business online, you need an online fraud detection tool. If you interact business over the telephone, you actually need to think about having voice print analysis or actually analysing the words that are used. If you interact by using documentation and uploads and portals, you actually need, again, a different fraud technology solution to look at the documents that are uploaded. So it's very specific to your business. But here at RSA, we are interacting with everybody across all different mediums, and therefore we have to have fraud response across all of those. And what's great for me is the market's got so many solutions out there that we're actually talking to an awful lot of solution providers and implementing market-leading technology.
Yeah, and that's an excellent example of the collaboration that we talked about in the previous episode as well, is that using the technology with service providers and the insurers and throughout the broker value chain, we can use those to tackle fraudsters. And we're talking about the importance of technology there with fraudsters, and obviously it's really important to have the right solutions for the right problems within our businesses. But when we are going out to combat fraudsters, obviously that technology is also supporting their ability to perpetrate fraud. And could you just talk about the sort of challenges that creates for a counter fraud team?
It's not really the trend so much as the volume.
Right.
So it's a lot quicker, it's a lot easier for them to get involved in fraud. I've also seen examples of fraudsters now selling documentation online for other people to use in fraudulent insurance claims. So it's more about the actual volume and repeatability that seems to be, I suppose, less of a barrier to entry to a fraudster. If you think about an old-fashioned, say, crash for cash ring, you may actually need the cars, you may actually need the people to do the induced accident at a roundabout. If you can just run through lots and lots of fraudulent shallow fakes online and just generate lots of documentation, that's also an awful lot cheaper and a lot easier as a fraud to perpetrate. So for us, it's more about how do we tackle the volume and start educating again our staff and our brokers about what is actually happening, what fraudsters are doing.
So just there, you've mentioned the importance of more managed risks, such as cash for crash. How can counter-fraud teams within the insurance sector respond to less managed risks, these newer types of fraud that we're seeing?
So it's exciting times actually here at RSA, and I'm really enjoying what we're doing at the moment. We're exploring new technologies, but for me, it's actually about understanding more what's happening in commercial property fraud, what's happening in liability fraud, especially where it's even though I've said organised, we'll move away to serial claimants,
right.
The serial claimant risks, but also spending some time talking to our marine claims teams, looking at what's happening in goods in transit is a really good example. What about cargo fraud? And so we're really diversifying internally and externally about the messaging about the different types of fraud. And we're learning as we go. What's really important is we're constantly seeing these new threats arise, and therefore when you see a new threat, you then have to start thinking of your strategies, how you investigate it, what technology you deploy, and then effectively how you defeat it. And then finally it becomes your prevention. So actually building that managed fraud risk strategy is probably one of the most exciting things we've done in the last 5 years.
So in your journey towards creating these and crafting these new counter-fraud strategies as well, especially in these new sectors, one of the important things in the counter-fraud journey at all is making sure that customers aren't unduly impacted by the counter-fraud measures. How are you approaching that with these new forms of fraud?
So it's really important that we think about this from a broker perspective, from an insurer perspective, and from a customer perspective. Fraud costs us all money. That's the main thing. The fraudsters are only in it for the money. They're not in it for the glory. They're in it taking as much cash as they can out of the system. And that, for me, is where you've got to balance the customer journey against dealing with a fraud investigation. Because at the end of the day, a fraudster is not a customer. But you don't want to be taking your customers down a journey that might actually slow down paying their claim. But we are really, really focused on making sure we have an effective first look at the case before we take it down the fraud route. We're very, very clear about making sure that vulnerable customers are taken out of the process, and in fact, really then putting all of our investigative strategies into fraudsters and making sure that we do prove it where we have the evidence.
Great. Well, that has been another expert view from Insurance Times. Thank you very much for speaking to us about the fraud sector and the challenges that we're facing and how we can overcome them, Adele. Really appreciate it, and good to speak to you.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
Good to see you.